Hello, I'm here with Louisa Casson, an oceans campaigner at Greenpeace, who's recently given a very interesting talk entitled, what was it?
Ending the era of plastic
yes,
pollution.
Ending the Era of Plastic Pollution at Greenwich University. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Louisa, thanks for talking with me. So, tell me about some of the biggest dangers of plastic pollution in our oceans.
So I think the scale of the problem is making plastic pollution really one of the greatest threats facing our oceans. We know that up to 12 million tonnes of plastic pollution is entering our oceans every single year, which works out as about a rubbish truck's worth every minute. So this is a problem that's kind of continually getting worse.
Yeah.
Once plastic is in the ocean, because it's such a kind of practically indestructible material, it will take hundreds of years to break down, or more accurately to kind of break apart into smaller and smaller pieces. These can be an entangling hazard for marine life, where it's things like the packaging that holds cans together, or things like straws, which can get tangled up, I think famously in kind of turtle's nose. You've then also got pieces that, as they break down into smaller and smaller pieces, are a choking hazard, or are simply just being eaten by marine animals. So we now know that plastic is entering all levels of the ocean food chain, from zooplankton up to blue whales, that 1 in 3 turtles has eaten plastic, and 90% of seabirds have been found with plastic in their stomach. So we can see that actually plastic contamination of our oceans is having widespread impacts on marine life, and it's also just travelling to all parts of the ocean. So, once it enters the ocean, if it enters in the UK, or if it enters in Thailand or North America, it will circle on ocean currents. So you've got these kind of huge gyres where currents are sort of forming in each of the major oceans, and these are really turning into sort of plastic soups, so that we're finding even on the most remote tropical islands in the Pacific, up to the Arctic and in the Antarctic oceans, scientists are finding huge amounts of plastic. And I think this is a real sign that it's a global problem, and we need global action to deal with it.
Definitely. So some very worrying facts there. And in your opinion, what are the biggest implications of this marine plastic pollution on humans, on both kind of a social and a health aspect?
So I think some of the issues and the reason why plastic pollution is becoming very sort of relevant, and it is being talked about a lot in the media and by the public, is because it's very visible. I think it's kind of one of those very standard environmental issues, in a way, of kind of the problem of litter and seeing pollution. And unlike carbon emissions in the atmosphere, this is very visible. I think a lot of people who are familiar with going to the beach or walking along the coast will not find it surprising to see plastic bottles, plastic packaging washing up or dropped around coasts. So I think there's partly kind of the issues around kind of community pride, and actually just having a clean area and a clean environment around you, and that's the kind of social side. In certain parts of the world, particularly sort of Southeast Asia, where a lot of our plastic waste is exported, that problem is really pressing, and you're finding people living surrounded by rubbish, and all the kind of associated health impacts of that. And then I think we could also look at the growing calls from scientists to actually look at what is happening to that plastic that's getting into the ocean food chain, and is that travelling back to our plates in seafood?
Yeah. And what are the dangers? You were talking about kind of this these microplastics entering the food chain. What would be the dangers of us consuming these microplastics?
So this is something that scientists have urgently called for more research on. And there was a parliamentary inquiry in the UK last year where MPs heard that in a plate of 6 oysters, there could be up to 50 pieces of plastic. We've seen new studies coming out recently which have shown how much plastic contamination has been found in other types of seafood that are commonly eaten. The actual health risks that poses for humans is something that requires a lot more information. MPs have called on the government to launch a full-scale inquiry into this. We haven't seen any results of that. The government said that they would be looking into it. And I think that's where we're going to really need to have more research, because, plastics, it's not just the kind of problem of finding plastics, but they also, as small pieces in the ocean, act as a sort of magnet for chemicals in seawater. So you're finding that some toxics that have been in seawater for sort of years and years are actually becoming kind of stuck on or adsorbed onto the surface of that plastic. As that's then travelling up the food chain, what effect is that having? There's possible kind of endocrine disruption, sort of hormone disruption to sea life itself, but we don't yet know what impact that has on humans. And I think that's where we really need to be kind of pressing for proper funding for that research to happen, so we can properly understand what health risks or potential health impacts are.
Very good. And moving back to the kind of physical side, what do you think can be done? Because obviously a lot of plastics will just stay on the surface of the oceans, but many of these pieces will sink to the deep oceans. What can be done about kind of salvaging these pieces, or can anything be done?
I think it's really tricky, and that's why sort of Greenpeace's campaign has really focused on stopping that flow of plastic into the ocean in the first place. We know that there are trillions of pieces of plastic that are currently in the ocean, and while there are certain technological solutions that are being put forward about trying to clean up the ocean, certain communities who are particularly affected are saying we could be doing this endlessly. So I think, the focus does really have to be on stopping this problem. As I said, there's currently a rubbish truck of plastic going in every minute. And to some extent, once plastic is in the ocean, it's very, very difficult to collect it again. I think there has also been some concerns raised about some of these sort of clean-up technologies of actually what impact would they have on marine life. So I think the focus does really have to be on land. We know that 80% of the plastic that's going into the ocean, the litter that's found around the ocean, comes from land-based sources. It's not, a kind of major part of the problem is not fishing or shipping activities, even though, they do contribute about a fifth. So there's some work to be done there. The focus really needs to be on moving away from single-use packaging, because I think that's the core part of the problem, that we're using plastic bottles, plastic bags for 5-10 minutes, chucking them away, and then they could last for hundreds and hundreds of years in the ocean.
And you mentioned earlier about us kind of shipping our plastic waste to these third world and developing countries. How can we prevent these countries from allowing the plastics to enter the sea? Because there's a lot of kind of videos and we see often that there's these huge dumps right next to the sea with no barriers to the water, and as the waves come in, it kind of takes in the plastic and then back again. So is there anything that can be done to prevent this happening?
I think, first of all, really recognising that this is a global problem. I think there's been quite an easy way to dismiss the problem has been saying, let's look at these kind of top 5 countries for leakage, plastic leakage into the sea, primarily in Southeast Asia. This is their problem to deal with. When actually we know that the majority of the companies that are producing a lot of this plastic, whether that's plastic producers, whether that's soft drinks companies or broader sort of fast-moving consumer goods companies, a lot of them are headquartered in North America, in Europe. So actually I think definitely not seeing that problem as just kind of end of the pipe and thinking, how do we exactly stop kind of waste management, and actually moving up and saying, why are we even designing things that aren't recyclable or aren't reusable? I do think there is a question about funding for waste management, and really sharing some of the lessons that are being learned. And we can see that governments around the world are waking up to this problem. It's something that's being discussed at the World Economic Forum now. It's kind of really like in those corridors of power. And you've got something like the UN Clean Seas Initiative, which is really sharing ideas around what could work well with sort of plastic bag charges. But I think, there is a huge role for corporate responsibility here, and that's where Greenpeace has been focusing in the UK. We've been looking at the soft drink sector and how, it's really endemic across the sort of top 6 brands that they are not considering the environmental impact of their plastic, particularly not on the impact it could have on the oceans. They're using a pitiful amount of recycled content, so actually keeping material in use. Sort of bottle to bottle recycling is sort of less than 10% globally of all bottles, and far too much simply isn't designed to be recycled or is escaping collection systems, and then it's very easy for it to get into our environment and end up in the ocean. So I think it's partly that looking at waste management, but it's kind of going further up and having really clear incentives through sort of regulation, but also making clear that there's that public demand on companies to no longer be making things that are simply used once and then thrown away. I think, you know, there is this kind of big culture change that's needed, that actually there is no such thing as a way for sort of throwaway plastic, because it is ending up in our oceans, it is ending up in all these places where it's causing lots of harm.
So you talk about this kind of public consciousness and kind of this cultural change that needs to happen. And I guess this kind of leads into what Greenpeace and you guys do best. So how would you, what were the best ways you would say there are, or the best ways you've seen or you have done to raise public awareness and raise public understanding of this problem?
I think in a way it's a great issue to campaign on, because the pictures really speak for themselves. As I said, you know, diesel fumes or carbon emissions are very difficult to visualise and to kind of make visible, this invisible killer, or kind of invisible pollutant, whereas plastic pollution is very visible. You know, you've got kind of lots of beach clean data, you've got awful images of seabirds tangled up in plastic, or of autopsies where, you know, there was a whale that was beached in Norway earlier this year. When scientists were wondering what had caused its distress, they found that its stomach was entirely jam-packed full of plastic bags and other plastic packaging. So it's something where I think there's a lot of evocative images around the harm that it's doing. And, you know, particularly at the moment when Blue Planet 2 is airing, there's kind of increased consciousness about the oceans, and, you know, people are amazed by marine life because there's so much that we still don't know. There's all these amazing creatures. So I think really tapping into that and showing the threats, and that's something that it's been great to hear David Attenborough speak out about and say, actually, when we were filming, we were seeing plastic pollution everywhere, and this does need to stop. I think there's some things about talking about the stats and, you know, having those kind of that sense that it is getting worse, things that are quite memorable, or, you know, trying to actually quantify how much plastic is being produced, how little of it is being recycled. And then I think also ensuring that people know that this is a problem we can tackle. You know, this is entirely man-made, and actually, you know, we have, as an environmental movement and other campaigning movements, we have stopped pollutants escaping into our atmosphere, into our environment. You look at things like CFCs in fridges, you know, that took a global effort, a Montreal protocol, but actually companies then got on board and they went much quicker than anyone thought possible. And now we are seeing, you know, actually a lot of those issues of kind of ozone depletion are no longer top of the agenda, because we acted and we stopped that problem getting worse, and actually we've, you know, the environment has been able to restore itself and recover to some extent. So I think being very clear about what alternatives are already existing, things like reusable packaging, looking at alternative delivery systems, so whether that's like drinks fountains, looking at the infrastructure around water fountains so that actually bottled water doesn't increase at the rates that companies are currently betting on it increasing. And, you know, I think actually it's something that a lot of people, because it's so entwined with our daily lives, a lot of people can get involved in, and it's something that we all as individuals can help reduce our plastic footprint. But I think pointing out where the responsibility lies, and, you know, you look at companies like Coca-Cola that are pumping out over 110 billion plastic bottles every single year. If they reduce their plastic footprint, that's going to have a far greater impact than if you or I do. So actually using our voices to call on these companies that are very receptive to changes in consumer preferences, calling on them and saying, actually, it's no longer acceptable to be using single-use plastic, and really kind of changing that social norm of a sort of throwaway society.
So obviously kind of looking at these larger companies, and maybe they're the way, well, like you say, they're the way to kind of change this public perception about plastic pollution. What are some of the best, on I guess a governmental side, and more on an NGO side, best ways you've seen, or best things you've seen that are tackling this problem, that are actually kind of going out there and doing something about the plastics in the ocean?
So I think really targeted government action has been shown to really work and be really popular. So you look at things like the plastic bag charge in the UK, which decreased plastic bag use, single-use plastic bag use by kind of over 80%, and halved the number of bags that were washing up on UK beaches within the first year or two of being introduced. We saw the huge kind of public support for banning microbeads as tiny plastic particles in toothpastes and face scrubs. And that brought together a coalition of sort of the Daily Mail and Greenpeace and lots of MPs, who often wouldn't be, all calling for the same thing. So I think there's a real opportunity there for governments to recognise that there is real public appetite to act decisively on these things. Equally, when you're looking at plastic bottles, which are one of the most common items that are found washed up on beaches in terms of plastic packaging, deposit return schemes are used by kind of over 100 million people, I think it is, around the world in various countries. They're particularly successful in some parts of North America and in sort of Nordic countries in Germany. And they're kind of using a similar principle to the plastic bag charge. You put a small refundable charge on plastic bottles when you buy them. Then when you take them back to ensure they're recycled rather than just chucked away, you get that money back. It's just a deposit. And they've boosted recycling rates to over 90% in Germany, in the Netherlands, in parts of Scandinavia, even over kind of 95-98%. So there's lots of things that governments can do. I think, some of the campaigns that have really impressed me are things like the plastic-free aisle, which is looking at supermarkets and saying, actually, that's where loads of people are buying their food. There's so much plastic packaging, around individual, like, bananas or broccoli or things that, are actually quite, either they have their own natural packaging or they really don't need lots and lots of packaging around them. So do we start to shift that norm of where people go and do their shopping and say, let's try and have an entire aisle which is without plastic packaging, seeing how possible that is, seeing the impact that has on manufacturers who obviously still want to be selling their products in supermarkets, and how that can start a kind of domino effect where actually we can see far more than just one aisle being plastic free. I think the refill campaign, again, which is something that started in Bristol and is now expanding to cities around Europe and wider, which is really focusing on making tap water really available and socially all right for people to ask for. So we kind of talked before about the amount of people who are embarrassed to ask for tap water in restaurants or in cafes. So their campaign is really simple. It's simply putting up a sticker in the window saying, we serve tap water for free, please ask us for it. And that's also then started conversations in cities about having water fountains, making it easier for people to refill their bottles. So you can see there's lots of different steps and stages and approaches people can take, because it is a huge problem, but there's lots of intervention points and there's lots of things that we know work.
Very nice. Well, yeah, it seems like you're very optimistic about about the future of plastic pollution. Louisa, again, thanks for talking with me.
You're welcome.
A very insightful chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you.